that's here this morning. Um, this was, I should say, put together in a few days, but the reality is it hasn't been put together yet. Okay. Normally, when I give a talk like this, I'm completely extemporaneous. It's no slides, no notes, just me and a few stories. Um, but usually, what I do is that I have an opening set of comments and a closing set of comments, and then I just extemporize in between. I don't even have the opening set today, nor do I have the closing set, but I'm going to give it my best shot. Okay. What I would like to do today is to strike a difference between leaders and those who lead. That may sound like a nuance, but I hope by the end of this, you'll see what I mean, that it is far, far from a nuance. Years ago, there was a company that had a ubiquitous brand. It was like Kleenex, okay? I mean, if you were about to sneeze, you wouldn't say, you got a puffs? Yeah, you would say, I need a Kleenex. And you don't care whether it's Kleenex or Puffs or anything else. The brand Kleenex was ubiquitous. Well, this company also had a brand that was ubiquitous. It was called Polaroid. Okay? They owned the market. Before Polaroid came up with instantly developable film and a camera that can take it, you had to take a picture, take it to CVS or Walgreens or whatever. 2 days later, you'd get it and you'd look at it and you say, crap, your eyes were closed. We got to do it again. But with Polaroid and the instantly developable film, you took a picture, a few seconds later it came out, and you knew whether the eyes were closed or not, or whether you liked that picture. And that brand became ubiquitous. Other people developed ultimately instantly developable film and cameras that would take it. But when they would go into a store, say, I need some Polaroid film. They didn't care what kind it was, but Polaroid film meant instantly developable film. It was ubiquitous. Now, like many companies who think they own the market and will forever, they became short on action, short on seeing what the market was telling them. And other people began to take over. And what they didn't see, most importantly, was the onset of digital photography. Well, it came. And pretty soon, people weren't going into stores asking for some Polaroid film. And they started losing money. And they lost more. And then they lost even more. Now, what do boards of directors do when a company is going south? Well, the CEO is running the company. So Polaroid fired the CEO. That's going to fix it. So they went out, okay, and they found themselves a big time leader. And they paid this guy a bunch of money to come in and save Polaroid. Well, of course, he came because there was a lot of money involved. Yeah. And what did he do first? He fired all the people that were there. And he went out and he brought himself in a whole bunch of new people, leaders. Okay. And he paid them a ton of money. Now, this leader, like most leaders, didn't hire up. He didn't want anyone to oversee it, shadow him. He hired down. Okay. So people would say, yes, boss, you're right. He didn't want anybody to challenge him. So he paid these people a bunch of money. And they started having, what do they do? Meetings. That's how you solve problems. You have meetings. So he'd have meetings and he would tell them what he thinks is wrong and what they should do about it. And they're saying, yeah, boss, you're right. I want to I want to tell you something. It is simply impossible for the head guy to have all the right answers. That is not possible, which is why when you read many of the leadership books these days, they tell you to hire up, not down. If you hire up, people will challenge your thinking, and maybe theirs is better. But if things work out right, who gets the credit? The head guy. So it makes sense to hire up. But most leaders don't. So what happened is that as digital photography became more and more ubiquitous, Polaroid began to lose more and more and more money. They lost so much that they were facing bankruptcy. As a matter of fact, when the board met, they realized there was no option. They had to declare bankruptcy. And this big time leader that they hired, they brought in to save Polaroid. You know what he did? He quit. He quit. Didn't even have the decency to try to bring Polaroid through bankruptcy. And you know, all those leaders that he hired, they fled the sinking ship. Why? Because they weren't going to get those big paychecks. So the courts had to take over and take Polaroid through bankruptcy. And you guys know the rest of the story. There's not much of Polaroid around anymore, is there? You see, that big time leader didn't work out for them. But he was a leader. Let me ask a question. No, I'm not going to ask a question yet. I'll hold it off. I want to tell you another story. I'm sorry I'm a storyteller. My wife hates it. But I was a teacher for a long time, you know. And as a teacher, you got to tell stories. If you just lecture, okay, the students will never remember what you're talking about. But if you couch a concept in a story, they remember the story and then they remember the concept. So I set out to try to show you the difference between a leader and one who leads. So I want to shift to another story. 61 years ago, close to the day, close to the day, 250,000 people from all over the country came in buses, trains, cars, and trucks. And those 250,000 people all showed up at about the same time, at the same place, and that would have been the mall in Washington, D.C., to hear Martin Luther King's I Had a Dream speech. Well, let me give you a little perspective. Okay. 250,000 people, I'm telling you. How did they come there? How did they know? How did they know where? How did they know when? I want to give you a little perspective. They did not have a multi-million-dollar ad campaign budget. They didn't have Facebook. It hadn't been invented yet. They didn't even have the internet. Al Gore hadn't invented that yet. How did it happen? Well, you see, Martin Luther King did not say, you know, guys, I believe that men and women and blacks and whites can live together in harmony. Not what he did. Not what he did. What he did was he said, I believe that men and women and blacks and whites can live together in harmony. And I believe the time is now. Well, you see, leading up to that speech, when he said things like that, there were other people who believed that too. And they told other people who believed that too, who told other people who believed that too. It was Facebook by people power. And 250,000 of them showed up in buses and trains and cars and trucks at the mall in Washington, D.C. at the right time to hear that speech. I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions. Hold your hand up if you know the name of that leader that Polaroid hired to save it. You know what? I don't see hands. I got another question for you. Hold your hand up high if you have never heard of Martin Luther King. I don't see hands. You see what I mean? You see what I mean? That leader that Polaroid hired, he was leader. Martin Luther King, he was one who leads. Do you see the difference? Now, I want to shift to another little story to try to bring those two things together. I have a friend, a longtime friend, who was employee number 30 at Apple. He was in charge of software development for the Apple Mac project. And he was on the campus of the Apple campus in Cupertino, California. And he used to walk every morning around the campus with jobs. Jobs like to walk the campus, okay? See what was going on. And so my friend Rob Campbell walked the campus almost every day with Steve Jobs. Can you imagine? I wish I could have done that. And then one day, he said to Steve on one of these walks, he said, Steve, he said, I have an idea for some software that we can do that will seriously improve our products. Yeah. Two of my nurses just walked in, my favorites. I'm sorry, I lost my place. So Rob said to Steve, I have an idea for some software that will really improve our products. And Jobs turned to him and he said, Rob, we don't do software. We do hardware. We make computers. And of course, my friend Rob backed right off and they continued their walk. Okay. A few weeks later, after another maybe 8 walks, they're walking around the campus of Cupertino, California again. And my friend Rob says to Steve Jobs, he says, Steve, I know I said this before. He says, but I really have this idea for some software that if we do, and I can do it, will really improve our products. And Jobs turned to him and said, Rob, I thought I told you we don't do software. We do hardware. We make computers. Of course, Rob backed off again until a couple of weeks passed. And they're walking the campus again. And Rob Campbell says to Steve, he says, Steve, I don't want you to get upset with me. He says, but I've said this before. He says, I really had this idea for some software we really should do because it'll seriously improve our product. And Jobs turned to him and he said, Rob, I've told you this before. We don't do software. He said, but you want to do some software? He said, leave with my blessing. Go start a company. Okay. Do your software if you want. Doesn't work out, I'll welcome you back. So Rob Campbell goes off and starts a company called Forethought. Had 10 employees. They only made 2 products, FileMaker and PowerPoint. Rob Campbell is a guy that invented PowerPoint. This is an amazing guy. He worked for Thomas Edison and Henry Ford. Jobs, oh, something I didn't tell you. After he developed these few products, Forethought was acquired by Microsoft. And that's why I was about to tell you that he worked for Thomas Edison and Henry Ford, Jobs and Gates. Now, he's enjoying his wealth on what they call a key off of Sarasota. It's a little island, okay, which he owns half of. But I want to go back and I want to tell you about this little company of 10 people and how he ran that company, how he created a culture of creativity, and how he nurtured that culture. Okay. One of the things that he did was he absolutely believed in an open door policy. He believed that it was important to listen to any idea that anyone had in the company. He believed it so much, he had him tear the door off his office. The ultimate in an open door policy. Why did he do that? Well, because it goes back to another story. There was a company that made toys, and it had an employee in product development who worked for the product development manager. His name was John Stakowski. So John goes home from work one day, and his son is all excited He said, Dad, I got to tell you what we did today. And he listened. John listened. Most people don't listen, especially their kid. Seriously. So the son, Ricky Stokowski, told him they were playing in their pool that day. And of course, it was an above ground pool. They didn't afford an in ground pool like most of us had. And he said they had 2 cans of peas that mom had taken the peas out of. So one side was open and the other side was closed. He said, so we punched a hole in the other side. We took a string and we put it through that hole. We tied a knot. We put it through the other hole, tied a knot. We stretched it out. And one of us go underwater with that can on his ear, and the other one would talk into it, and he could hear him. And John thought about that for a second. He said, you could really, he said, yeah, Dad, I could hear him. He said, we did it numbers of times. So the next day, John goes into work, and he goes to the head of product development, who was his boss, and said, I'd like to talk to you. Well, his boss listened to him. He listened to him. And John related what happened with his son the day before. I'm going to cut to the chase. They came out with the water talkie, a blockbuster product that made that company extremely profitable. Why? Because there was a product development manager, one who leads, who listened to somebody down in the organization about a kid named Ricky Stokowski that birthed the water talkie, saved the company, made it extremely profitable. So my friend Rob Campbell had an open door policy too. He would listen attentively to anybody in the company that had an idea. Another thing he did, everyone in the company, everyone, all 10, even the woman that answered the phone, had to spend some time on the customer support line. Why? Good question. Because if somebody calls in on the customer support line, they've got pain. It's called a problem. A problem is pain. He wanted his employees to feel that pain. And of course, if they're on the customer support line, they got to solve the problem, which meant they had to be intimate with their products. So everyone in the company had to spend time on the customer support line. 3, everyone in the company went to, what's the word, John, when they have, you go where people show their products? Pardon? Yeah, okay. They would go to these, what? Trade show. Thank you. Everyone in the company had to go to the trade shows. Why? Okay. Because if you're at the trade show, you got to man the booth. You man the booth, you have to demonstrate the product, which means you had to be intimate with the product. Everyone. And of course, in your off times when you're not manning the customer support table, you walk around and you would see competitors and you would see their products. The greatest form of flattery is emulation. So you might see something that you could bring back to your product and make it stronger, better, faster, cheaper. So everyone had to go to the trade shows. These were things that my friend Rod Campbell did in this little company to create a culture of creativity. It is a culture that is very much like the culture that exists where I am right now in skilled nursing, in rehab. There is a culture of compassion and care and concern. I was telling my friend Kenny this morning, you won't know that until you have to go there and someone has to wash you. Can you imagine how demeaning that is for the first time? Well, you know, I needed washed. And I was washed by a CNA. And she did it with compassion, care, and concern, wiped my discomfort away. That's culture. You see, you can't buy that. If someone's making 20 bucks an hour, you can't say, hey, I'll pay you 25 if you have compassion. Doesn't work that way. It has to be a culture. And that was the culture that my friend Rob Campbell wanted to create and nurture in that company, a culture of creativity. And that's why today he lives on a key off of Sarasota. And every one of those 10 people similarly, because he shared the wealth. So I hope you see the difference between leaders and those who lead. None of you remembered the name of that big time leader hired by Polaroid to save the company. But everyone in this room remembered Martin Luther King. One was a leader, the other was one who leads. I hope you see the difference. This was short, no slides, no notes, just me and a couple of stories. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something. Now, if anybody has a question they would like to ask me, I'd be pleased to answer it. Yes?
Yes, this is really not a question, I guess, but I've just become aware of Google, the company. I think they're trying to develop a culture. I have a great nephew who's very bright, went to Pitt and is into computers so much that he's just been hired by Google. I can't take any credit because he's a great nephew by marriage, but I'd like to.
That's okay.
Yeah. But I understand that they feed them. They take very good care of them because they want them all to be there and to talk and to throw ideas around and so forth. So I think what Google is doing is trying to develop a culture. Would you agree with that? Just in what I've
I
said?
not only agree with it, but I would tell you that they already have a culture. It's been developed and is being nurtured. There are a lot of people that work at Google. I I know something about Google because I spent some I spent a lot of time out at Stanford, which is very near Google's campus. And we had the head of creativity for Google as part of a teaching team on a course we we're doing in creativity. A lot of people at Google are young. They like to live in San Francisco. Well, it's a pretty good drive from San Francisco down to Google's campus. And so Google provides a bus that buses them down. And on that bus, they got Wi-Fi so they can work on the way and collaborate. There are a lot of young people at Google that are concerned about the environment. The penetration of EVs at Google, electronic vehicles at Google, is very much higher than the public. And so Google has all over the parking lots chargers. So people can drive their EV down, plug it in, go to work, come back, and they got a full charge. At Google, if a manager doesn't listen to the people in his department, he doesn't stay there long. They're not only trying to create a culture, they have a culture, and they are trying to nurture that culture to keep it going. I hope you see the little nuance there difference. Great place to work. Yes.
I really enjoyed this. I used to teach also, but never had the gift of storytelling that you do. I think my students would have been better off. But I taught leadership for a while, and I think um, what's interesting about it is how often there are leaders behind the scenes that tell you that there are gradations of leaders. There are the people that we know who become famous or memorable for some reason, and they've probably been mythologized. And then there are the people behind the scenes. And an example of that is in Martin Luther King's speech. It really would not have been organized as well as it was, all the churches and all the organizations that pulled the people together, had it not been for Bayard Rustin, who decades later probably is only getting his fair share of the acclaim because there was a movie about him a couple of years ago called Rustin, but he really was instrumental, much more so than the people who did get credit, like A. Philip Randolph and John Lewis. And that's one thing I wanted to say. And the other thing is, I didn't teach private sector leadership. I taught government. And Michael Lewis has been doing a series in the Washington Post, which I no longer read. Anyway, I won't go into that, but he profiles government people behind the scenes, including one individual who was responsible for making sure that miners have safe working conditions single-handedly, and it's taken him 30 years to do this. But because he's the kind of person he is doing it behind the scenes, he's actually accomplished something great that nobody really knows about. So just because he's not famous doesn't mean he wasn't a leader. That was my only point.
Well, it actually is a good point. I think the point you're trying to make is that those who lead aren't necessarily the head people. Those who lead often are down in the organization. It's the product development manager that listened to John Stakowski. That was one who leads. He had in his department a culture where he would listen to anybody's ideas. and he was one who leads. So it's not often that it's the head guy. Those are the ones you hear about. I doubt that anybody here has heard of John Stokowski or Ricky Stokowski or John's product development manager, but it saved that company. Yeah, Kenny.
I was going to tell two short stories to reinforce what you were saying. In my first profession, where I wore green a lot, armor officer basic, they played a trick on us as lieutenants, and I used it a lot after that. And they would say, all right, how do you, as an officer, where do you gain your authority to issue a lawful order and expect the soldier to respond immediately, correctly, etc.? And by and large, the new lieutenants would say, I get my authority from the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I get it from the Constitution. And he would be straightened out. You get your authority from your subordinates, and they can follow you or not follow you. And leadership is, how do you develop that they will do that? What kind of environment? An example, a friend of mine, a guy named John Woodmansee, was a Huey pilot in Vietnam as a captain. And there was a place that an American unit was being massacred. And he ran to his helicopter and said, I'm going in there. I'm going to get out what I can get out. And his commanding officer said, no, you're not. You'll be killed instantly. You won't have a chance. And he said, yes, sir. And he ran to his helicopter, cranked it up, and flew into that hot landing zone and flew out with 10 or 11 badly wounded Americans in a helicopter that would never, ever fly again. It was shot to pieces, but he got it back to the airfield, where he was sort of dressed down and told, don't ever do that again. And he said, yes, sir. And he ran to the next helicopter, got in, and went and did it again. So selective disobedience is in a way a kind of leadership. But the two stories are kind of related.
I wouldn't disagree, Kenny. Yes. Laura.
One thing that you said is that a lot of what makes the people move forward in the companies is this sort of informal contact, listening, talking to people. And I just wonder what you think that effect of so much now being online and how that will affect how companies will move forward.
First of all, I think that everything online, we have access to virtually everything instantaneously. I sometimes, when I think about this, think, well, this is a good thing. And other times when I think about it, I think this is not so good. Because everything that you get online detracts from your interest in and ability to listen to everyone in your organization, because you think you already know it. So at times I think instantly available information about everything is good. Other times I think it's not. So I don't have the answer. Shell.
Dad, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's kind of funny because in our family,
Yeah.
my mother will say, you and your father need to build me a clock. And when all I want to do is know what time it is. So, but thank you. I enjoy all your storytelling. My question for you is, and I think I may know the answer, these skills and qualities are transferable. You know, it requires passion, it requires humility, it requires listening and being observant in your environment. But do you think that we all can lead? Not necessarily in our organizations, but perhaps when people are retired or in our personal lives as well.
I think that everyone in this room has the capacity to be one who leads. I don't mean by that that everyone outside of this room has the capacity to lead. The difference is that there are some people who believe they know it all. And they believe it passionately. No one knows it all. Even though they believe it passionately, they don't have the capacity to listen. They don't have the capacity to understand that someone in your organization down there might have a better idea than you. They don't have the capacity to accept that their ideas aren't the best ideas. And those people can't be people who lead, one who leads. I hope that answers the question, honey. Yes.
Bill, thank you. This has been very interesting to hear all these wonderful stories. I'll just share one that I had in my career that was better than all the management classes that I ever took. And I was in a meeting with the head of engineering development for IBM. And his technique, I'll never forget. People would come in and give him presentations on the status of different projects. And there would be 4 or 5, sometimes 6 people troop in. And it would be the first level, second level, third level manager. And some poor guy, usually a guy, was in the department that had to give the presentation. So he would get up and he would give a marvelous story about how wonderful this was all going. And the engineering development manager would look at him and he would say, "That was really a good presentation. I'm here to help though, and I would just like to have your opinion on what you think I should know."
On what I think what?
On what you think I should know. And he would just stop talking and he would sit back in his chair and there would be a long pregnant pause while this poor man was figuring out whether or not he was going to be fired the next day or not. But he always came through with what was a problem they were dealing with that they could not get resolved. And I'll never forget that management technique was so effective.
I want to tell you that that long pregnant pause may have been purposeful. You know, there are a number of core presentation skills. Only a few. Okay? One is moving around. Okay. If I were able to, I would be walking up there, down there, over, I would be getting in every one of your faces, moving around. If I'm moving around, you're watching me. If you're watching me, maybe you're listening to me. And that's my objective. Number one. Number two. A pause brings emphasis to what you're going to say next. So you can be talking about something, and for example, I can be relating to you about John Sikowski going into his boss's office to tell him about Ricky Stikowski's invention. That little pause gives emphasis to the next thing. And I want to guess that the pause, the pregnant pause that you talked about may have been purposeful. That guy might have been very smart. Any others? Kenny?
I call it the right stuff. And I ran into it a couple of times in the Army. There were people that others would follow almost blindly. And there were people that nobody would follow. I don't care if he was Peter Drucker, they weren't going to follow him. And I tried, how do I deal with that? I had a captain that I ultimately had to relieve because his soldiers wouldn't follow him. But what he had a goofy mustache and a sort of a Spaceballs haircut, and I don't know what it was, and I wasn't sure how to counsel him. I mean, I could call him in and I can say, you might be more effective if you shave off your mustache, but that won't work. Uh, is there such a thing as right stuff in leadership?
Absolutely, there is. And it had nothing to do with his mustache. It had nothing to do with how he had his hair. It has to do with the capacity to get others to believe that you are open to ideas, you will listen to their ideas, may not do something about it all the time, but you'll give them the courtesy to listen attentively. If you don't do that, no one's going to follow you. Everyone is going to think you got the right idea. Well, if you're going into battle, you better know the guy has the right idea, not think it. And he just didn't have it. He didn't have the right stuff. Anyone else?
I have a story that I think you already know, but it has a different lesson. And that is that sometimes a culture really encourages experimentation, invention, learning from failure, and people will be, I guess, tolerant enough to wait around to see whether or not something can be turned from a failure to a success. And it's an unusual organization that can do this. The story comes from 3M and the fact that two chemists found an adhesive that didn't work in aircraft engineering, and it stuck to paper, but it didn't really last. And so you could take it off and then you could put it back on something again, often another piece of paper. And then you could take it off and you could put it back on. And they kept experimenting with this and said, maybe there's a use for something like this, which of course is a multi-million-dollar
Boom,
product
Post-it
today.
notes.
It's Post-it notes, yeah. But think about it. It took a lot of time to invest in that product. It took a lot of time to convince people that there was a use for it. But the
Absolutely.
culture had to tolerate that kind of leadership and invention.
I actually used that same example of Post-it notes in an entrepreneurship class that I used to teach at UF. I'm like a little bit crazy when I get to teaching. I did a lot of research on a lot of different things that I could use in class. Now I read stuff that I just like to read. But I found that and I used that same example in an entrepreneurship class. Any other questions?
You have a comment on Zoom.
Okay.
Can you read it or you want me to read it for you?
Bill, your chagrin,
Charging station.
your charging stations at Google reminded me of that in 1977 GE Sylvania, there were 1 or 2 charging stations. I want to tell you, Google, when I was there, which was in 2014, what I related to you, they had every 3rd parking spot had a charging station, and they had men out there working because they were going to make it every 2. Anything else? Guy, yeah, we have one more. Go ahead.
Somebody who's getting her exercise in today. Um, yeah. When I'm listening to you today, and I know you were in the business school, college here, um, I think, yeah, that's the way things should happen in the business world. I was in that world for a little while as an accountant. But I was also in the world of education, teaching um, individuals to work with special populations. And I think what you're talking about today is not only the managers, the head people, it's teachers everywhere. Because if you don't have the empathy, if you don't listen, then you're not as successful as you could be in that world.
You're absolutely right. And I want to remind you of one thing. One of the stories I told you about was Martin Luther King. He had nothing to do with business. He was one who leads. He had nothing to do with education. He was one who leads. So it doesn't have to do with business or education or any other single thing. It has to do with everything. You see, there are cultures everywhere. There's cultures in church groups. There's cultures in clubs. There is a culture right here in this room. And what I'm talking about is creating and nurturing a culture to do whatever it is you want to do. Lead people into battle, create new products, teach better. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Richard.
Yeah, your discussion of culture reminded me of what's going on with Boeing. The CEO of Boeing appeared on TV the other day and said we have to change the culture. And I wondered if you would have any comment on that. Evidently, Boeing had a very good culture, very successful. In recent years, something happened. The culture deteriorated in some way.
No, it didn't
And-
deteriorate, Richard. The culture changed. The culture changed from one of creativity and openness to a toxic culture based on profit. It was commercialization gone amok. I have to tell you that I admire what the head of that organization said. We have to change the culture. That's the first step. You will never change a culture if you don't recognize it needs change. So I admire what he said. Let's wait to see what he does. Well, that looks like it's it. Guys, I want, oh, one more. Yeah.
Just because I happen to be reading a book right now about this very thing. Sorry. And it is Tracy Kidder's book called Rough Sleepers. He was a very successful doctor from Mass General, went out, gave up all of his big bucks and elite experience to work with the homeless and set up an entire place in Boston for safety for these homeless people. The homeless wouldn't talk to anybody else, but because of his empathy and compassion, they talked to him and he got this whole thing started. The book Rough Sleepers, I really recommend it.
Thanks very much for that.
Okay, is that
I
it?
guess we have one more question and then we'll call it quits.
Thank you. I think one of the key differences we haven't mentioned is, and I've taught kindergarten all the way through graduate school. And was that? Oh, closer? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we got to write that down. was it wasn't listening. It was hearing. The mother load variable here is actually to hear what the person is saying. And you could see it at graduate school, all of that, but I could see it with my first grade kids. They would tell something and they would blah, blah, blah. And the adults in the school didn't hear it. I don't know what they thought they heard, but they didn't hear what the child was saying. And the key variable to me is the first variable, listening is the door opener, is to hear what was actually being said. And the third one is to understand. And if you can get those three together, you can actually lead in very powerful ways, I think. And I could see it with little children, I could see it with intermediate children, I could see it with very brilliant adults. And I think we don't talk about that enough.
Well, I agree with what you just said. There is a very big difference between listening and hearing. If you're talking to somebody who you think is open to listening to you, and you see him like this, you see, he can't wait for you to stop so he can say something. He's not listening. He may be hearing you, but he's not listening. He can't wait to say the next thing. So he's not internalizing anything you say. Shell,
Just a real quick comment. I really like what you
Shell,
said
bring
about
it
this.
closer to you.
Sorry. My mother's usually telling me quiet, so I'm not used to that. Sorry. I think that's also very interesting about the listening, the types of listening and listening to hear. But in coaching certification, we talk a lot about listening to respond, which is what you're describing, versus listening to understand perspective. And I like that.
Guys, I have had an absolutely wonderful time spending the morning with you. It's gotten me out of rehab for a while. I'll go back because they really are taking good care of me there, and I'll be out of there soon. But I really enjoyed being with you this morning. I enjoyed your questions, but most of all, I enjoyed you listening. Have a great day.